afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We'll be just getting started here at 1:30.
I see a few more people joining. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. We'll get it's not quite 1:30 yet, so we'll give it a few minutes before we get started here. See some familiar names. That's good to see. Thanks for joining. All right, we'll give it just a minute or two here in case there's anyone joining late.
I know Mark's not going to make it. He's traveling. I know he was on the list, but
All right, and actually, I think this is the bulk of everyone else who was on the registration list. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for joining. I see a few people on the list who again I'm pretty familiar with. Thanks for coming and joining us this afternoon. This session is on Aruba ClearPass. It is going to be mostly technical. There's not really going to be any marketing fluff in here, so it should be hopefully a little more interesting. It's not going to be, I've got a quick 3-slide PowerPoint here, just more for housekeeping type things, and everything else really is going to be a demo that you'll see pretty much live here. I've got Josh Podemski here with me, kind of as a moderator. He'll be available to answer any questions. Please use the chat for that. And then we can open it up at the end for questions over audio if you'd like. So I'm going to jump right in here and share my screen. So again, this is the Aruba ClearPass workshop. Basically, it's kind of try to get you the idea of, do you really know what's on your network? You have your servers and your firewalls, your access points, your cameras and whatnot, but Are they behaving the way they should? Can they, talk only to the things they should be able to, or, is there maybe some open risk here that you might have? Again, my name is Luke McCormick. I've been with Camera Corner for over 10 years now. With me is Josh Podimski. He's been here, I think, 9-ish, a little over 9 now. A lot of our focus is network infrastructure, wired, wireless, firewalls, et cetera. And we both spend a lot of time in the Aruba portfolio. Aruba now being a Hewlett Packard Enterprise company as of about 5-6 years ago. So that's a bulk of what we're really going to see here. I've got a little bit of a topology map. Relatively simple. I like to keep it simple, but you're going to see that this is pretty powerful, even with just a few components here. So we've got an Aruba ClearPass server that's actually a VM in this environment. They do have a physical appliance option or a virtual option. We've seen both. We've done both. I've got some Aruba access points. Those 303 hospitality APs are mostly there to show you profiling, and we'll get into what that is here shortly. I've got an Aruba 505 actually going to be providing the client access wireless that you'll see in the demos, and then an Aruba 6300F switch, which we're not going to see a whole lot of, but you will see some, and then the wireless controller off to the side. We also are going to show a little bit of integration with Jamf, which is an Apple mobile device management solution, as well as some integration with Fortinet. That's just two of the many third parties that ClearPass can integrate with, and we'll show kind of some of those ideas here in a little bit. And I'll show this at the end again, but thanks again for everyone joining. Ultimately, these will be the phone numbers and emails that you can use if you do have further questions after the fact. And I'll show this again at the end. So I'm going to jump right into a couple things here. ClearPass is a hardened appliance. Again, it is a physical or a virtual appliance. What we're going to show here, yes, ClearPass is an Aruba product. The switches and the wireless products that I showed on the previous page, those are all Aruba products. That being said, 99% of what we're going to show today is actually doable with ClearPass and other networking devices like Cisco, Juniper Extreme, et cetera. Really anything that can make use of the Radius protocol for network access, which is pretty much anything that makes, any vendor that makes corporate networking gear under the sun is going to be able to do something with ClearPass. And some of those additional things, even outside of just the Radius functions, a lot of those vendors will do as well, like Captive Portal, for example. We already showed some of the integrations with, Jamf, Fortinet. ClearPass also integrates tightly with Active Directory, Microsoft Azure's Intune, Active Directory already, Aruba's Airwave product, Palo Alto firewalls, in some instances Cisco firewalls, depending on what you're trying to do. So Aruba ClearPass is part of a family of products that we would call network access control. And that phrase is pretty simple to understand what it's actually getting at. It's basically controlling access to your network. At the core of most network access control products, there is a Radius server. ClearPass is a Radius server, but it's able to leverage those third-party integrations to provide additional context. And so there's multiple databases within ClearPass. It's able to plug into generic SQL databases. For example, if you have Microsoft Dynamics or Microsoft SCCM, which has a SQL backend, you can plug ClearPass into SCCM, for example, to get additional information about devices, to verify that those devices are indeed a corporate device, for example, or Jamf or Intune to do the same thing. It can tightly integrate with anything basically that has a open API. So the Fortinet and Palo Alto integrations use their APIs to communicate between the two platforms. There's also additional integrations that are kind of a nice to have in a way. It can kind of help your help desk workflow, can help your IT flow, and it can also help give you notifications for if something is out of the normal, something that you don't want to happen has happened. So you can get messages via SMS, via email. You can also integrate into some instant messaging platforms like Microsoft Teams or Slack. And some of the supported integration also includes like IT help desk ticket creation, like with ServiceNow. ClearPass itself is developer ready. So if you have other products or you're using Python or something like Ansible to automate onboarding of devices or inventory systems, they can automatically populate information into ClearPass as well. So that is kind of a two-sided thing. ClearPass is often described as, and we'll use this analogy a lot, as a bucket of Legos. Network access control can do a whole bunch of different things, which we'll see here. And there are multiple ways that you can basically come to the same conclusion. And those different Lego pieces can be, how does your environment look? How specifically do you want this workflow to look like? We also, again, the ClearPass is context aware, meaning we're not just looking at a certificate from a device or a username and password or a MAC address, for example. We're going to leverage additional information from platforms like Jamf or Intune to determine, okay, yes, this is either some random device off the street, or this is indeed a product that the company owns. ClearPass can help an organization enable zero trust, which is kind of a security scheme that a lot of companies are either trying to get into or are, kind of being forced into based on, some compliance requirements. It also can help you enable microsegmentation by reducing the amount of data that can pass between endpoints. And so an example of that would be, in most cases, you might have a printer on the same VLAN as some of your desktops in the office. In most cases, a PC doesn't need to talk to another PC. They're all, communicating through backend applications in the data center or in the cloud. But you might need to talk to the printer on the network. So you can enable that microsegmentation to say, I can talk to certain things within my network, but I can't necessarily talk to things that I shouldn't or don't need to. So I'm going to give kind of a quick tour of the interface of ClearPass. Everything is GUI driven. It is not a CLI platform unless you're working with, Aruba TAC to troubleshoot a, kind of a severe issue, which is, in my experience, very uncommon. It's very unlikely to ever get to that point. The main dashboard is probably not a place I would spend a lot of time, just because it's really pretty self-explanatory. It's pretty simple. We can see our servers and their status. You can have multiple ClearPass servers in a cluster for redundancy, or to span, multiple regions for performance reasons. If it's, for example, an international organization, you can see some basic CPU utilization of the hardware itself. How long are the processes or are the authentication requests taking to process? How many requests or authentications per day for the last week? And then some quick links here off to the side. One of the major contextual components of ClearPass is the endpoints database. The endpoints database basically keeps track of the devices that it's seen on the network or that it's told it should be aware of that might be on the network. Okay, so these devices get populated anytime the ClearPass basically sees network traffic from these devices or is told about them via Jamf or Intune or from a network access device like a switch or a wireless controller. Within the endpoints database information, there is what we call attributes, which sometimes these start empty. If it's just a device that's, is talking on the network, maybe ClearPass isn't doing anything with it yet. This information in this example here actually came in from Jamf. So this is a MacBook that is enrolled in Jamf, and this information was put into ClearPass by Jamf based on in what we call an endpoint context server. Jamf didn't just put it there because it wanted it to. We had to connect ClearPass to Jamf to your Jamf account, and then your inventory is pulled in here. And so we can leverage this information to do all sorts of different things. We see group names here. So I can have a different, what we'll call enforcement based on the group that it's in. Or maybe we just want to allow it access to the network based on the fact that it is MDM enabled, and we've seen it in Jamf, okay? So those are, some of that additional context that I was talking about. Some of the other information that we see here on this tab, like the fact that it's a computer, it's an Apple Mac, and it's a MacBook, came simply from just the DHCP fingerprint. So when the device connected to the network and asked for an IP address from DHCP, ClearPass heard that information and then basically was able to tell what kind of device that is. A lot of people don't necessarily know this, that different operating systems and different devices actually have a different DHCP fingerprint in the DHCP request, and that's part of how ClearPass can determine what types of devices are on the network. It's also not purely based on the Mac OUI or the first half of the MAC address, which identifies the vendor, but it does track that as well. That's one of the things that you can leverage if you want to say, well, if the MAC address of vendor doesn't equate to the brand or the type of machine that it really should be, if it has that MAC address, you can leverage that to say, hey, something's going on with this device. I don't want to let it on my network. Okay. So there's several types of profiling that ClearPass can do. The HTTP fingerprinting is one thing. The additional context from Jamf is part of the profiling. You can set up a port mirror on a switch or like from your firewall, which will help ClearPass understand, okay, what kind of network traffic should I expect these devices to have? And so you can leverage that type of information to make the decisions about how and what devices I'm going to let on the network. We can also pull SNMP information from switches or access points about the ARP tables and the MAC address tables, so you can actually understand in some cases where the device was seen. So for example, this MAC address was seen on an access point on this network SSID and its connection was wireless, okay? So that can be kind of beneficial. And we'll also track some of that later on. The attributes can be customized if you want to put something in there that's custom to your organization. And we will show that a little bit later in a demo actually. So I'm going to go through a little bit more of the interface here. So endpoints is really kind of a big deal if you couldn't tell already. We will talk about enforcements, profiles, and policies a little bit later. You have network devices, which actually refer to switches, access points, firewalls, basically anything that's going to interact with ClearPass via radius. Administration, we have the endpoint context servers, which I mentioned briefly earlier. So here's where we actually plug in ClearPass to Jamf. You basically say, here's my URL, I have a login, and that's how, that will basically enable ClearPass to go talk to Jamf and pull in that inventory information. I also have a Fortinet Fortim manager here, which will allow us to take some user information and send that to the firewall so that you have a better log of, when you look at firewall logs, I don't just have an IP address anymore. I now have potentially a username that's associated with that IP address. So we'll see that a little bit later as well. The start of the workflow, basically workflow meaning device plugs into the network or connects to an SSID to what VLAN does it get placed in, what access list gets applied to the user, what kind of access on the network does it actually have. So that all starts with the services, okay? So the services really are all what we call if-then logic, okay? And it's relatively simple, in my opinion. In order to match to the service, we need to decipher what kind of connection is being made. In this case, I'm saying that anything coming from the Aruba mobility controller on the SSID demo TLS is going to hit this service. I'm going to take that authentication and I'm going to look for the EAP TLS, which is certificate-based authentication, against Active Directory. So basically, if a certificate is on an Active Directory joined computer, I'm going to check that certificate that the computer gives to the wireless network before it gets on the network to make sure that it's actually authorized to get onto the network. Authorization, so we can use different types of information to determine you know, the who, what, where, when, why, basically, of this connection. You'll see there's a time source here. So the built-in clock and calendar built into ClearPass can be leveraged. I can say that only certain devices can connect to the network at certain times of the day or certain days of the week. I can reference the guest device repository. I know that the guest is a little throwing here. You can register devices beforehand, and that's part of kind of the zero trust mechanism. So if the device is registered, I can say only let the device on if it has been registered by someone on my team first. We have a tab called roles. Basically, roles are nothing but a label to apply to a certain type of logic. So it's easier to read and it can be called later for that actual enforcement. So it just kind of adds some flexibility and it's easy to just look at that label and you know what basically what that means. So for example, if a computer authenticates from Active Directory and its radius attribute of full username begins with host, which is how an Active Directory computer tries to do an authentication, basically we know that's an Active Directory computer. If it's not a host, but still coming from Active Directory, and this user is in the IT users OU, it's an IT user. Otherwise, if it's just in the regular users OU and not in the IT users OU, it's just a regular AD user. And we're going to see that a little bit here in the demo, what that actually turns into on the back end. So the enforcement is ultimately the last thing that happens in the service workflow. So you'll see here we have, if the role equals computer, these enforcement profiles are what gets applied. The enforcement profiles are combined to perform actions. All right, those are the end actions that are sent back to the network, like the switch or the wireless controller, to say, yes, the user gets on the network. Here's some additional information on who they are, what they are. Here's the VLAN they should be in, for example. And then also one of these is to post to FortiManager Manager, which is what tells our firewall who's who. So again, an enforcement policy here is made up of multiple rules of logic and enforcement profiles. Okay, so we're going to go on to a demo here. I've got a computer that is falling asleep over here. Get that going again. Here we go. So this computer, we can see, it's just a Windows 10 computer. It is on a domain. We can see that it currently is connected to demo TLS wireless network. And before we log in here, I'm going to show you that in the Aruba wireless controller, right now I have one client connected to this wireless network. If I click on that client, I can see that they are on the demo TLS wireless network. I have a host name here of host. Like I said before, that's kind of what we're looking for in ClearPass from that logic to determine that this is a computer. And I have the host name here as well, and it also gives me the IP address that the client currently has. So for reference, that third octet being 15, actually the second octet being 19, the third octet being 15, this VLAN is 1915. So kind of easy to keep track of there. You'll see another one in a little bit is 1913. That's in this environment, the guest VLAN. You can see here the role or the label again is an Active Directory computer. I'm going to go back to this demo here. And I'm going to log in as myself. And so what we're going to see here in ClearPass, Access Tracker, just for everyone's information, is kind of your best friend when it comes to, number one, seeing what ClearPass is doing, and number two, when you're doing any kind of troubleshooting. And what's interesting here is that authentication I'm not seeing here, even though this was working about 20 minutes ago. That's how things go though, right? Isn't it? All right. So I'm just gonna do some live troubleshooting here. I'm going to sign up. Sorry about that. I think it might have to do with the fact that this access point actually is in the other room. So my signal is probably not as strong as it could be. I'm gonna disconnect from that wireless network. And I'm going to reconnect here. All right, so let's see where we're at. Okay, so it's a computer. Okay, so looks like it did work that time. And just so everyone's aware, you know, we're doing these live demos so that we can show you this is not smoke and mirrors. This is not marketing. We do have one of the largest school districts in Wisconsin actually running ClearPass for these exact, for a lot of these demos that are going on here today. So like I said, I think it probably is more due to my signal strength in this area of the home from my testing prior. So we can see here again, Access Tracker really is kind of your best friend for troubleshooting the logic and the flow of how this works. We can see again, initially the computer had logged in here. We can look at the times, 3:50. So, you know, pretty much right, just, you know, about a minute ago. So we click on this, we see many, many more details about that connection. So this basically was a computer sitting at a login screen with no users logged in yet. And ClearPass knows it's an AD computer based on the logic that we programmed in. and then the enforcement profiles ultimately taking place. It's an Active Directory computer. It's a domain machine. We're going to send that information to FORTA manager, even though it's not actually a user at this point. We might want FORTA manager to know that. For example, if a computer is sitting at a login screen and we wanted to make sure that it gets its Windows updates, maybe we build a rule in the firewall around if it's a computer, okay, maybe we don't let it get access to most websites, but we do want it to get to a Windows update, for example. And now that I've logged into this computer, we can see from the roles, and again, labels, they don't necessarily mean anything unless they mean something to you. So the role being, in this case, it's an IT user. It's also an AD user because it matches that label as well. But based on the order of the logic, it's going to hit the IT user first. So in this case, we sent it the role of full access. Someone being an IT probably needs to get to, the switches and this RDP servers and that kind of thing. So what we're going to see here in this demo is, actually, if we go back to the controller and verify this as well. So now the controller, we'll see it's the same IP address as before. It is on the same WLAN as before. Now we have that username and the role to the controller that they have. Going back to that workstation itself, I'm going to take a look at my IP address configuration. So 15.100, that's what the controller reported. These are my DNS servers here, the 172.22.3.11. I'm going to open up an RDP session to that server. Okay, pretty typical stuff. Okay, that let me in. Perfect. I'm also going to open up an SSH session to the switch that I'm using here. Okay, so I'm logged into the switch. That's really all there is to that specific portion. Now I'm going to show you the actual interesting part. So I'm going to log out of this computer. We're going to go back to the controller, make sure that the user actually did log out. So when it goes back to the login screen after someone's been logged in and has now logged out, it does actually revert back to just a computer. I'm going to now log in as just a regular user in this case. And while that's logging in, we'll see what the logic looks like in ClearPass. It's going to be very similar, but slightly different, right? Okay, so now we've seen Mark has logged in here. Let's see, did that disappear on me? Let's see what the controller says here. Okay, so controller logs sometimes can be a little bit behind. These ClearPass servers need to be downsized a little bit to fit in a lab environment. They're not too heavy in production, usually around 8 CPUs and 8 gigs of RAM for a small VM. There we go. So here we see Mark. You'll notice in the roles, we don't see an IT user, but we do see an AD user. So based on the logic that we put in to the enforcement policies, the rule set basically, this is showing you that now, again, AD user and not a full access user. And again, in the controller, we see that as well. So it's Mark, it's an AD user. Again, you'll see it's the same IP address. I'm going to go to the demo again, and you'll see from the IP config on the machine, same thing. It is the same IP address. It's the same DNS servers. I can ping the DNS servers. I can look up, I can do DNS resolution through that server. That server being my domain controller, though, maybe I don't want an end user to RDP to that server. And so you'll see here, it is just hanging. This session will actually just time out, which is kind of what you want to happen in this case. I'm also going to open up a PuTTY session. And this is just going to sit here and time out as well. So this is kind of that micro-segmentation portion that I alluded to, where you can literally take different contexts, and apply different rules, right? So yeah, your IT team, they need to be able to get to the back end and manage these switches and these servers, but your end users might not need to. Of course, you would probably allow RDP to, for example, your Citrix Farm and your RDS servers, or maybe some application servers that they do need to get to, but you don't need to allow every end user access to like your Active Directory domain controllers. Okay, so it's kind of showing you the power of ClearPass integration with Active Directory in an Active Directory environment, which is most customers that we do run into. So Okay, so on to the next demo. I'm going to show the integration with Jamf. I am not by any means a Jamf expert, but was able to get it functional enough to work for this demo. So what we're going to show here, I've got a MacBook here, the fresh install, not quite fresh install here. I'm going to log in as a local user in this case. Currently, I'm not connected to any of the demo networks. And what we're going to see, pop this open here. And we're going to go back and look at the services. We're going to be using the PEEP method for this. In a lot of cases, Macs don't really play super nice with TLS. Sometimes PEEP is really your only option. The difference is TLS is purely certificate based, where both the server sends a certificate to the client and the client sends a certificate back to the server, and they both authenticate each other. It is considered the gold standard for security because certificates are very difficult to transfer between devices, whereas PEEP is really based off of, okay, I trust the server, but I'm also just giving you a username and password, which, as you know, people like to share those things sometimes when they shouldn't. Anyway, so for the logic here, we're basically looking for endpoint MDM enabled equals true. So what that logic means, if we look at that endpoints database we looked at earlier, we'll see that my Luke's MacBook is already known. It's actually seeing both the wired and the wireless MAC address. That gets pulled in from Jamf automatically. So again, looking at this rule logic, endpoint being the endpoints database, MDM enabled equals true. So that actually comes right from this attribute screen we looked at earlier. MDM enabled equals true. We're also verifying that the endpoint source, meaning where did it come from? It came from Jamf. And we can verify that here as well. So based on the order of the logic here, we want to see that because this endpoint is enabled in Jamf and it is MDM enabled, hopefully we should get the Jamf computer role when we authenticate. So we're going to go back to the demo and we're going to connect to that PEEP network. Login as another user. In this case, you might have to have Jamf tell the computer to trust a certificate because you normally would not use a publicly signed certificate like from DigiCert for Radius. That's not a best practice, but that's kind of outside of the scope here. Definitely something we can take into account if we were to deploy this for you. Again, this is something that we can talk about, and you can basically make this pop-up not happen in a production environment. All right, so now we are connected to the PEEP network. My IP address is 15.103, so I'm in the 1915 network in this case. If we look at Access Tracker, we'll see that, sure enough, there's Bart. He's on the PEEP service. The role applied was Jamf computer and AD user. So in this case, it's guaranteeing that it's both been enrolled in Jamf. It is basically a corporate owned machine in this case. And it's also an AD user because I logged in with an Active Directory account. When we go back to look at that logic, if the role is Jamf computer and an AD user, we're going to let it on VLAN 1915, which is the production network in this case. What I wanted to show about this, and some companies will opt to use this option to allow employees to connect their personal phones to the network, but in this case, you wouldn't necessarily want those to be on a on your production endpoint network. You'd probably want them to be in your guest network. And so I'm going to pop my phone out here and switch that input and show you another piece to this. Okay, so wait a second for this to pop up. Okay, so we can see my phone now. I'm going to connect it to the demo PEEP network. I'm going to log in with that same user account, just kind of, I guess, show this is not smoke and mirrors. I'm actually gonna, which I think is blanking out my password already, isn't it? I'm gonna do this anyway. Okay, so we are Same kind of thing. If it's a device that isn't yours, they're not necessarily going to trust your internal PKI. So an end user bringing in a device of their own and connecting to that network, they'll probably get this prompt. We're going to go ahead and trust that. So we'll see here, I'm on the 13 network, which, like I said before, that's my guest network. So the logic is going to make a lot of sense here. We can see again, it's BART and it's the same service. However, this time we did not get a role of Jamf enabled because this device is not enrolled in Jamf. So you can see that just adding a tiny bit of logic or a bit of additional context helps you enforce the network access that helps make your network secure and doesn't let people do things they probably shouldn't be doing. Some of this stuff is doable with NPS, but no one likes to look through NPS logs because they're not easy to read. They're also just not going to be this flexible or provide this additional context to help guarantee devices are owned by the appropriate people. Okay, so that was that demo. ClearPass comes with a guest portal option. And what this is really for is for visitor management, but it's also to allow, you can present users with pages, basically web pages of information if something were to go wrong, and we'll show that here as well. I am going to move this video input over here. Actually, you know what? I might just do this on another phone here. Second, pop that up. Okay. And again, we're back on this phone. Okay, so I'm going to connect to the guest network here. Once it connects, basically ClearPass has never seen this device before, is what we're trying to demo. Give it a second to actually connect and do what it's supposed to. So you'll see here we're getting redirected to a captive portal. If I were to close this and try and browse the internet, it would actually bring me back to this page. This page is completely customizable. You can customize it yourself. There is an additional license where you could pay Aruba to basically customize this page for you if you wanted something really fancy and you don't have the internal staff to do so. But most of the customers that I've seen are able to customize this in-house to a point where they're satisfied with it. So what we have here is a form basically asking for your name and email address. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to skip ahead and click on, you'll see the link here, already have an account, click here to sign in. So I'm going to sign in there. One option here is I can actually log in with, and I'm going to close the screen here again just because that's my password. So here's another option for getting your actual employees access to the guest network. And instead of just having a MAC address or an IP address, you can now track who's who. If you have the need to, see who's doing what in the firewall, let's maybe make sure that if it's the CEO's phone, maybe they need to get full access to the internet and not be filtered from things that other users maybe should be filtered from. So we can see now, we're going to look at Access Tracker. It knows that was Alex. It knows that that came from Active Directory. You can see that it's an Active Directory guest, and you'll see in another demo here that it's not just a regular guest. So that would be an option for users who are employees, need to connect their phones. Basically, it's either this option or the option you saw in the previous environment. Oftentimes, guest networks are open with no pre-shared key, which we don't recommend, but some people kind of insist on that. So this is not encrypted in the air, but most traffic on the internet is encrypted with HTTPS today. So maybe not a big deal, but you could still leverage that EAP environment so that all of the wireless traffic is encrypted that way. So this is just kind of another spin on that same idea. I'm going to go back to the demo here and basically make a new device by turning off MAC address privacy. Turn this on. So I'm going to reconnect to the guest network. This is basically now seeing a new device, ClearPass seeing a new device because I basically changed the MAC address of the device by turning off MAC address randomization. So in this case, we'll get the captive portal again. I'm going to log in as, let's see here, whose name can we come up with? Let's do John Smith. We'll do john@smith.com. So this would be for an example, you have a vendor coming in to your environment, or someone walking in out the street, walking into your store or whatever, and they want to get on the Wi-Fi. So you can use this to basically get some contact information if you want to send them some marketing information or whatever, or just to be able to, if they are doing something illicit, you now have that on your firewall log, and you now have a way to contact them, basically, as long as they put in a legitimate email. There's a few things we could talk about to kind of help guarantee they're putting in a legitimate email address in this case. But we're going to go ahead and self-register this user. You can see here they're given an automatically generated password. That's on the fly. Every user gets a different one. It's unique. We can see here that the expiration time is about 24 hours later. You can set that. So, and that's going to be an important note in a little bit here for the next piece of this demo. So basically, after that 24 hours, if they reconnect, they're going to get the captive portal again. Within that 24-hour period, if they walk out of the store and come back 20 minutes later and reconnect to the guest network, it'll actually let them rejoin without a captive portal. We have a use case we used for a customer where we're leveraging this with Active Directory to basically say students get a certain filter on the firewall, staff and teachers get a certain filter on the firewall, and this allows them to get the appropriate filter based on who they're logging in with. But they didn't want to have to log into a captive portal every single day, so we set that expiration time to 6 months down the road. So that kind of gives them an easy way. You know who they are, and every day you know who they are coming in. They don't have to go through the hassle of logging in, every hour, leaving for lunch, coming back, logging in again. That got kind of frustrating. So anyway, to move on here, so I'm clicking log in, and now we're logged in. And what we're going to see here as well is, even though that did not come in from Active Directory, for example, we can see that we still got their email address in ClearPass. The other great thing about this is if I go to the controller, I actually see that email address in the controller as well, and they are a true guest versus an AD guest in this case. Let's see, I think I have this piece set up here at this point, so I'm going to show it. So one of the integration pieces here that we have, again, is with Fortinet and some other firewall manufacturers. So again, not only are we, your typical logs in most cases without something like this is going to just show you an IP address. You're never going to be able to keep track of who that IP address belongs to, especially on a day-to-day basis. And because the bulk of this actually is based on the MAC address, which never changes day to day to day, you will see that you will see the username in the firewall, as time goes on as well. So it's not just purely that, based off of that IP address. So if they connect tomorrow and they get a different IP address in the firewall, it's still going to show their username. So it looks like, for whatever reason, that specific name may not have come over. This might actually, I may have used a different username or a different demo previously for this, and it could be keeping some stale info. This Fortinet integration is relatively new, and this is my first time setting it up, so I might not have something quite right in here, but that's not the IP address I should have. It's a lot of Bart and Alex. Anyway, I will have to troubleshoot that a little bit later. I'm going to go back to this screen here, though. I'm going to disconnect from the guest network. I'm going to log into the controller. So the user is currently on the network. So we can see john@smith.com. He's got the guest role. He's on the demo guest wireless network. And his authentication type was web, meaning he came in from a captive portal login. So that was the first time we logged in. Now ClearPass is going to remember the MAC address of this device. So I'm going to disconnect that user. We'll see. Currently, the controller is not aware of that user account. And I'm going to turn Wi-Fi back on here. So you're connecting back to guest. And you'll notice that this service of demo guest user authentication with MAC caching basically alludes to being the captive portal login itself, the first time the user connected and went through that web page. The second time, they're just doing a MAC authentication and leveraging information that ClearPass remembered and recorded from the device to use for later information. Okay, so it's a much simpler time to get on the network the next time. And again, that's that 24-hour expiration period that is adjustable based on your needs. And then the same thing also does work if you're using that for the Active Directory login. One other thing I want to show about the guest network that's kind of cool. I'm going to go back to the computer that I have in the domain on Active Directory. Make sure the screen comes back. There we go. So we can see we're still on the TLS network. And I'm going to try to connect to the demo guest network. So again, this is a corporate owned machine in Active Directory. Maybe I want to make sure they can't actually get to the guest network. So here we were able to leverage some information that we are tracking within ClearPass to say, your computer is a corporate asset. And now that we know that, we're going to make sure you can't get onto the guest network with that device because you should be on the secure network. So it's kind of a nice thing, you know, if whether someone's trying to get around something or whether they're unintentionally doing something they're not supposed to, sometimes it's nice rather than just having something not work and they get frustrated and think, oh, this wireless network is horrible. I don't like this brand of wireless network, right? Well, instead of them thinking that it just isn't working, let's maybe give them an explanation. And this is an example of that. So if they're doing, again, if they're doing something on purpose or you know, not on purpose, we can tell them, hey, here's what's going on. Here's what you need to do to resolve it. So that's one thing that's kind of nice about that. And I can show you the logic behind that here. So within ClearPass, again, we have the services. That initially was on the TLS network. And what we're doing is when that computer connects, we're sending an enforcement profile which says mark domain machine. What that enforcement profile does is it places an attribute in the endpoint database for that machine. It is a domain machine and that equals true. That attribute does not exist by default. And so we basically have to put it there and tell it to mark it true or false. So once the computer has authenticated via Active Directory using certificates, we know it's a domain machine, so we're going to say that. Okay, then we're going to continue using that logic for something else later on. And in this case, that is the guest authentication, where within the enforcement, we're saying if the endpoint is domain machine is true, which is that checkbox I just showed you, yes, technically we're allowing them access, but it doesn't mean that we're getting them onto the network in a way that they can get to any system. This role here basically tells the controller, look, put them in a guest VLAN, so they can't get to anything anyway. They can only talk to you know, HTTP to the ClearPass server to get that web page, and then show them that web page so that they have some idea of why things aren't working the way they're supposed to be working. And again, all those pages here, this is something I just made up. This template is part of ClearPass. I just changed the text around for it to you know, make some sense with what I'm trying to show. So you can do this for anything. There is a additional component to ClearPass called OnGuard, which is a plugin that you can install on Windows machines. I guess it doesn't have to be installed. There are agentless options as well. But basically it can assess the health of a computer. So is my antivirus installed and up to date? Is my firewall on? Do I have the latest Windows patches? So if the computer falls out of compliance with either of those and you want to put them in a quarantine role so that they get their updates before they actually get into the full network, you can leverage a page like this to tell them that. Tell them, hey, look, there's, you know, your antivirus is out of date. We're just going to update it before we let you onto the network. So that way it's not just something not working and they get frustrated. You're explaining to them why what's happening is happening and potentially how to alleviate that issue. Okay, so the last major section that I want to show here is what we call zero trust, or part of what we call zero trust. Open up that capture utility again here. So oftentimes, something that's often frustrating is someone goes out and buys 100 security cameras, right? And they want those security cameras provisioned on the network tomorrow. No one ever finds out, a month in advance. It's always a day ahead of time, right? Or even the same day. So now you've got to go find, okay, what switch ports do I have open? Where are these getting cabled to? I have to go configure the VLAN on those switch ports, right? What if I told you that you could have your contractor, your security contractor, or even your maintenance person in-house, they can log into ClearPass with their Active Directory account, and they can register the security cameras themselves. And then from that point, they can just find an open port on the switch, plug it in, and the network guys don't need to know anything about it. Because based on the registration, the switch is asking ClearPass, hey, what do you know about this MAC address? And ClearPass can profile that device and say, okay, based on what we see here, this is a security camera and someone has registered it. And so we're going to allow that security camera onto the appropriate network for security cameras. So that's kind of part of what I'm going to show here is a little bit of both of those pieces. So the guest portion, again, is a little bit misleading. ClearPass used to actually be two separate products that were purchased and have now kind of been molded into one platform. And then some functionality integrated and added from both. So on the guest side, there's the idea of creating a device. This form is customizable, and you'll see there's a list of roles here. So I could say that I'm going to register an Aruba AP in here. And then I know that, excuse me, the access points with the MAC addresses that I've registered are the ones that are going to be allowed on the network, granted that I put that logic in the enforcements to look for that. So again, you could consider this to be a security camera, for example. I can register my access point 15 or 25. So once I click there, now if I plug in that device with that MAC address, again, based on my logic, it will put that in the access point VLAN. Same thing with security camera concept as well. So that's one part of the zero trust is basically, every device that's in your network, and only the people who are supposed to be able to register certain categories of devices are able to register those devices. You'll also, in many of those cases, right, you might put an ACL in that role that says, hey, the security camera can only talk to the NVR. I don't want the security camera talking out to the internet. Let's think about the whole, I believe it was the Home Depot hack about 5 or 6, 7 years ago. The attackers got into the HVAC system. And you might say, oh, okay, who cares if they got into the HVAC system? But what they did is they leveraged the HVAC system to use lateral movement to get to other parts of the network. Okay, so some of the things that we can do is, again, make sure that the devices can only talk to the parts that they should. Maybe you want your users to talk to the NVR. You want the NVR to talk back to the users, but you only want the cameras to talk to the NVR. You don't want the cameras to talk to other users or servers or printers or anything else. That's all stuff you can do here. And again, that's all stuff you can do with ClearPass, with Cisco switching, with Extreme switches, with Juniper switches. It does not have to be an Aruba network for those things to function. Anyway, I'm kind of going down a tangent here. What I'm going to do is log into my switch here. I should have plugged these in first before I did that. So I've got these two access points I'm going to plug in. So what this is doing, I plugged in some access points to their switch ports, and those switch ports are controlled by ClearPass. Show port access clients is basically going to show me this same thing that we were looking at on the controller from the switch perspective. So ports 7 and 8. Maybe I had my syntax wrong here. Interface 8. And these access points, they do take a little bit to power up. They're computers. So, like I said, I probably should have plugged them in before I started going down that tangent. Sorry about that. And we're just gonna let this go here. Okay, and actually here we see what I wanted to see. So if you were to look up these MAC addresses, again, the MAC addresses of those devices, you would see that's an Aruba access point or an Aruba product. You'll see the role that was given to them initially is unprofiled. ClearPass knows that it has not seen those MAC addresses before. It isn't sure what they are outside of it. Knows that the first half of that MAC address means that it's an Aruba device. You'll see that they just disappeared. Basically, what's happening is when those devices come up and the switch talks to ClearPass and says, "Hey, what do you know about these guys?" ClearPass says, "I don't know. I'm going to check that out though." And you'll see now it came back as an Aruba access point. All right, both of them did. I'm going to stop that. I'm going to go to ClearPass and let's look at that logic a little bit here. So the two MAC addresses here that we have ending in 7A02 and 4762. We can see here that initially they came up as unprofiled. If we look at the access tracker for the unprofiled entry, we're going to look at the input and the endpoint attributes. The information that is now here, for example, it being an access point in Aruba AP, that was not actually there at this time. If we look at the new profiles or the new authentications, we now see that yes, it is an Aruba AP based on the logic that we put in there. But when we look at the authorization attributes, the information actually used to make the decision, now that information is there. Okay, so one other thing I wanted to point out there is based on the programming of ClearPass, we basically told ClearPass that if the device is not profiled, once it's done profiling, ClearPass needs to send a command to the switch to basically shut off that port and bring it back online, which is what triggers the device to re-authenticate. So that's called a COA, or a change of authorization. Basically, okay, we've seen what we need to see. I know that I need to basically disconnect you to force you to reconnect so that you go to where you're supposed to go. That's why we have the two separate authentications about 45 seconds apart. So now we see, again, after they profiled, now they're in Aruba AP. You'll notice I did not actually register those APs in the guest portal like I was showing you earlier. And I just kind of wanted to show you a piece of that, in the role, we see that within the endpoints database, basically if the device is profiled is false, meaning it's not profiled, or if the is profiled attribute doesn't exist, then we know that it's not profiled. And for the unprofiled options, we're going to enforce the unprofiled role. The unprofiled role will then bounce that switch port after the fact. So that's another side to that zero trust, right? So we have the device registration and or you have the device profiling. Depending on your requirements, maybe you want both. Maybe you don't necessarily trust the vendor coming in to register those security cameras, or maybe not so much a trust thing, but just an extra validation, right? Okay, here's my MAC address, but it's actually my laptop. It's not a security camera. Well, you can say that, hey, they registered a security camera, but it's profiling as a Linux laptop. Okay, I'm not going to let it on the network, right? So that could be a place where you might leverage both the device registration and profiling to give those devices appropriate access. There is, and hopefully this goes correctly here. I'm going to try something I haven't done in a while. I'm going to, so where's my input here? I'm going to plug into this other laptop over here. Now unplug these access points. There's about a 5-minute period within ClearPass where if a device is seen connecting to the network multiple times within 5 minutes, it's not going to profile that device again. Or it's not necessarily going to pay that much attention to profiling. After 5 minutes has gone by and it sees that device connect, it will try to reprofile it again to basically verify that it still is the same device. For example, kind of similar to what I was just talking is, what if we have a MAC address that's registered and it's not really the device that says it is? There's an additional component to this, and we can see from the endpoints database, I'm going to look at, I believe it was this 4762. So last profiled at 1421, so 221. It's been about 5 minutes. I'm going to give it a little more time so it goes over 5 minutes. And this is actually in reference to the timestamp that ClearPass gives you at the bottom of the screen as well. Let's go back to this demo. So this Windows machine, if I look at the driver for the network card, the locally administered address, this is how you can tell Windows to use a MAC address that is different than the burned in one on the NIC, okay? Just going to grab a cable here. So what I'm going to do, you'll see that, again, that device has that MAC address configured. I'm going to kind of verify that. We can see, again, if you look this up, that's an Aruba MAC address, even though this is a Windows machine and it's a NIC on that machine. And I'll plug that in. So let's watch Access Tracker here. Okay, you'll see I did move that port. It's a different port, but it would be the same if it was on another port. Now, understand that it has to actually allow some access to the network in order to profile it. So that's why you see that currently coming up as an Aruba AP. However, once it gets profiled, ClearPass should mark that as a conflict, meaning a MAC address spoof. And now you can see we've actually re-authenticated it. We've kicked it off the network, and the device tries to reconnect. And the device has now noticed we labeled it as a conflict detection. Again, that's a spoofed MAC address. We don't want that on our network. If someone tries to put an access camera MAC address on a Windows machine and plugs in, we don't want them getting complete access to the network. Again, it does have to give some access in order to profile the device, but once it understands that it's fake, it will kick it off the network. And we've seen that live here. If we look at that MAC address now, so here's a default Windows PC name. That's an Aruba MAC address. Again, you can look at the endpoint database and we can see the MAC vendor is Aruba, but this is a Windows 10 computer. It also tells you here, this is what it used to be. You can manually resolve this, but this is basically, one of those things that, here's the power of ClearPass. Let's make sure devices are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And keep in mind too, in addition to all these things that I've shown you, one of the things I mentioned earlier is, all the integrations. That does include things like I can have that denied access because of a conflict automatically send, a certain distribution group an email, send a certain Slack channel notification, open up a ticket in ServiceNow, and so that can get addressed immediately before the user, even has to call IT or whatever. So, and in some of these cases, if it's malicious, you're not going to know that unless you have some kind of notification, right? So leverage the platform to keep you informed about what's actually going in on your network. So again, kind of the whole point of this demo was to show you, you really can get a handle on what's on your network. You really can get a handle on how they're connecting to the network, where they're connecting to the network, when they're connecting to the network, and what network they're actually placed in, and control what they can talk to on the network. With Aruba switching, wireless, and some other vendors out there as well, you can place a firewall access list right at not even the port level, but the MAC address session in the device, in the switch or the wireless access point to control it. This does not have to go back to your core switch or your firewall to get that control. It happens right at the port or the session level. Okay, so that's really all I have for demos here. I kind of want to, at this point, open it up to anyone who has any questions for myself or Josh.
We did not have any questions in the chat.
Okay, I do see. Okay, Elise said something. All right. I guess maybe Elise can help me out with that if we need to. I don't know how to unmute the attendees. If anyone wants to ask a question.
I can make them allowed to talk. Just give me
Okay.
1 second here.
Sure.
All right. It looks like they are all able to talk now. So if anybody wants to come off of mute and ask any questions, feel free.
I just realized I'm on mute. Sorry about that. Again, I want to thank everyone for coming out and seeing this today. We really appreciate your time. You know, ClearPass is something that obviously is quite powerful. Does some pretty cool stuff that a lot of people I don't think know is really out there. You know, it's something if you guys want to see additional additional demos on, you know, specific, how would we do this? Can we do something like that? We could do a POC in your environment if that's something you're interested in, or for pricing information, definitely feel free to reach out to us. I'm going to share my screen one more time here just so you have that contact information. And actually, I think for the two gentlemen who are here, actually, I would probably reach out to your account rep. Since you have an account with us already, you already do quite a bit of work with us. So otherwise, you can email us at this link or this phone number on the screen here. Other than that, again, I appreciate everyone's time. Thanks for joining.